The air over the Lakota camp carried that thin, metallic chill that came just before the first snow, the kind that gnawed at bone and made even the strongest reach for their warmest furs. And it cut through Nahila's skin as if she were made of paper, her bare feet raw and cracked from the long miles behind her. She had been found that morning at the riverbank by the hunters, crouched over a strip of dried corn she guarded like a treasure, an Apache girl far from her own people. And now she stood in the trampled circle of earth at the camp's center, the open sky above her as wide and merciless as the eyes staring from every side. Men paused in their work to look. Women whispered with lips close to each other's ears, and children hid behind the safety of skirts or the legs of their fathers. The smell of smoke drifted through the air from cooking fires, and beyond the ring of lodges, horses whickered in the corral, their breath misting in the pale light. From the shadow of the largest lodge, a tall figure stepped forward, moving with the slow assurance of one who never needed to rush to be obeyed. Tyan's hair was bound in a single thick braid down his back, his shoulders broad beneath a buffalo hide cloak, and his two sons stood in the doorway behind him, one on each side, their small, dark eyes fixed on the girl as though she were a riddle they hadn't yet decided to solve. Nahila met his gaze without lowering her chin, though her heart pounded hard enough she feared the whole camp could hear it. He stopped a few feet from her, his shadow stretching long in the cold morning light. And when he spoke, his voice carried so clearly that even the furthest listener could hear. "By winter, you'll feed my sons." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. A few murmured, others frowned, and someone let out a quiet breath as if they understood something she did not. Nahila blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. She had walked for days with nothing but her stubborn will to keep her standing. And now a stranger, though his eyes were not cruel, was speaking to her as though her fate were already sealed. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice steady, though her fingers curled against her palms. Tyan's expression did not change, but the firelight from a nearby lodge flickered across the scar that curved along his jaw, a pale mark against his bronze skin. "Then you'll freeze before the moon turns." One of the men from the hunting party stepped forward and placed a folded blanket of woven wool into Tyan's hands. He extended it toward her, and the gesture was simple, yet heavy, with unspoken meaning. She hesitated, knowing that to accept it would be to step into his shadow and the rules he lived by. The wind off the river cut through the thin cotton of her dress, biting deep, and the ache in her feet reminded her of the 3 nights she had spent without fire. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing the coarse weave before pulling it close around her shoulders. It smelled faintly of smoke and pine resin, a scent that wrapped her in something older than her own memory. Tyan's gaze flicked briefly to his sons, Kiro and Mako, before returning to her. "Come," he said simply, turning toward his lodge. She followed, feeling every set of eyes on her back, the weight of their judgment pressing down like the promise of winter itself. The walk from the central fire to Tyan's lodge was short, yet it felt like a gauntlet Nahila had to run, her every step echoing in the hush that followed his declaration. The camp seemed alive with quiet hostility. Women's eyes followed her, some openly disapproving, others appraising, as if weighing her worth in invisible coin. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, whispering to each other in the Lakota tongue, their words quick and sharp. The sound of a secret passed hand to hand. Nahila kept her chin high, the wool blanket drawn tightly around her thin frame, the rough fibers scratching her skin but shielding her from the bite of the wind. She caught fragments of scent: wood smoke, drying hides, boiling meat, each one grounding her in the foreignness of this place. Tyan strode ahead without glancing back, his heavy steps unhurried, the fur cloak shifting across his shoulders as though it had grown there with him. His sons trailed a few paces behind, not close enough to invite conversation, but near enough to keep her in sight, as if guarding a fragile animal that might bolt. When they reached the lodge, Tyan held aside the stitched hide door flap, gesturing for her to enter first. The warmth hit her immediately, a wash of air scented with cedar and sage from the small central fire. The walls, sewn from thick hides, glowed faintly in the firelight, their seams etched with the careful work of patient hands. Cairo and Mako slipped inside after her, settling cross-legged on a fur near the flames, their gazes never leaving her. Nahila stood awkwardly until Tyan motioned toward a folded elk hide in the corner. "You'll sleep there," he said in the same steady tone, neither unkind nor inviting. "Until you've proven yourself, that's all I can offer." She sank onto the hide, its softness a surprising comfort after so many nights on bare ground. But her voice remained cool when she asked, "And what is proving myself to you?" Tyan crouched by the fire, slicing dried venison with a bone-handled knife, the blade's tip glinting in the firelight. "You'll feed them, teach them, keep them warm," he said, nodding toward his sons. "They've had no mother for 3 winters. That's what you'll do." She studied the lines of his face, the scar at his jaw, the way his dark eyes reflected the flames, and saw a man used to being obeyed. Outside, women's voices rose in laughter, the sound edged with something sharp, like a knife drawn against a whetstone. "And if I can't win them over?" she asked. Tyan placed the strips of meat on a flat stone near the fire to warm. "Then you'll be gone by the first snow." His matter-of-fact tone held no cruelty, only the weight of truth. The words should have frightened her, but instead, a flicker of defiance stirred in her chest. She glanced at Kiro, whose eyes were guarded, and Mako, whose curiosity seemed almost to soften his face, and felt something she could not name, something that made her want to stay, if only to see what might grow from it. The wind moaned faintly against the lodge walls, a reminder that winter's shadow was already falling, and she knew her time to prove herself had begun. Morning light seeped into the lodge through seams in the hide, thin as threads, spilling across Nahila's face and pulling her from a shallow, restless sleep. The fire had burned low, leaving only a few embers that glowed like the eyes of some watchful creature in the dark. Tyan was already gone, and the boys sat side by side near the fire pit, threading beads onto a strip of leather. Their small hands moved with the skill of habit, yet neither spoke to her. Nahila pushed herself up, the blanket falling from her shoulders, and felt the chill settle over her like a challenge. She had no plan for this day beyond survival, but she remembered Tyan's words. Feed them, teach them, keep them warm. It was both a duty and a test. She rose, stepping carefully over the fur bedding, and crossed to the clay pot resting on the hearth. Inside, a small amount of cornmeal lay at the bottom, the last of the food left from the night before. Her mind flicked to the camp beyond the lodge walls, faces watching, waiting for her to fail. She gathered what she could find: a pouch of dried choke cherries, a handful of beans from a basket pushed against the wall. The boy's eyes followed her, curious but silent. "I'm making porridge," she said quietly, as if declaring it might make it true. She fetched water from the nearby barrel outside, the cold biting her fingers until they ached, and returned to set the pot over the rekindled fire. The boys exchanged a glance but said nothing. As the scent of cooking grain filled the lodge, Kiro finally broke the silence. "Our mother used to put honey in it," he murmured, almost as if speaking to himself. Nahila looked up, meeting his gaze. "I have no honey," she said softly, "but I have cherries. They'll make it sweet enough for now." He gave no reply, but Mako leaned forward, intrigued. When the porridge was ready, she ladled it into wooden bowls, setting them before the boys. They ate cautiously at first, as if expecting disappointment, but after a few bites, Mako's shoulders loosened, and even Cairo finished his portion without complaint. Nahila felt a small, quiet triumph, too small to show, but warm enough to keep her standing. When Tayan returned, the smell of cedar clinging to him, he glanced at the empty bowls and then at her. "They ate?" he asked. She nodded, expecting nothing more, but he simply grunted and moved to hang his bow on the lodge wall. Outside, the camp stirred to life, voices calling, tools clattering, horses snorting in the morning air. Nahila knew her day's work was far from over. This was only the first step in proving herself. Still, she caught Mako watching her with something close to a smile, and for the first time since she'd stepped into this camp, she felt the faintest edge of belonging, fragile as a bird's bone but worth holding on to. That evening, after the camp's main fire had dwindled to glowing coals, Nahila sat alone inside the lodge, mending a tear in the edge of the elk hide she slept on. Outside, faint voices drifted through the cold air. Women gathered in a small circle, speaking in low tones they didn't bother to hide. Her name wasn't used, but she heard enough to know they were talking about her. Stray. Doesn't belong. Taking food meant for others. Each word struck like a pebble against her skin, too small to wound deeply but impossible to ignore. Cairo and Mako sat on the other side of the fire, their heads bent together as they worked on a small carving, a project of their own making. Every now and then, Mako's eyes would flick toward her, quick and curious, while Kiro's remained steady and unreadable. Tayan had not yet returned. He'd left before sunset, his bow slung across his back, saying only that he had business beyond the ridge. The lodge felt both too quiet and too loud. The crackle of the fire seemed to fill the silence between her and the boys, and the distant laughter outside sounded sharper in contrast. Nahila finished her mending, set the hide aside, and reached for the clay pot. She decided to make more food. Maybe it would keep the cold from settling in their bones, and maybe, though she wouldn't admit it to herself, it would show the boys she meant to stay. She poured water from the barrel, the splash startling in the stillness, and added dried meat and beans to the pot. The rich, earthy smell slowly filled the air, drawing Mako closer. "You cook like my mother," he said softly, almost shy. She paused, meeting his eyes. "That's a good thing, I hope." He nodded, then glanced at Cairo, who kept his gaze fixed on the carving. Outside, footsteps crunched in the frost, and a shadow fell across the lodge entrance. The hide flap lifted, and Tayan stepped in, the cold following him like a second skin. His eyes swept the space, fire, boys, her, before settling on the pot. "You've kept them fed again," he said, his tone unreadable. She only nodded, unwilling to turn the small satisfaction into something he could dismiss. He crouched by the fire, warming his hands, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then, as if he'd been weighing the thought all day, Tayan said, "Tomorrow, you'll come with me to the river. If you're to stay, the camp needs to see you work beside me." Nahila felt a flicker of unease. She'd never been tested under so many eyes, but she inclined her head. "I'll be ready." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of snow, and she knew the real trial was only beginning. The next morning dawned under a sky the color of iron, heavy and unbroken. Nahila rose before the boys stirred, braiding her hair tightly to keep it from the wind. The air inside the lodge was brittle with cold. the kind that made breath visible even near the fire. She wrapped herself in the borrowed blanket, its edges frayed from years of use, and stepped outside to find Tyan already waiting. His bow was slung across his back, a spear in his hand, his expression as unreadable as the frozen river they were about to face. The camp was stirring, and she felt dozens of eyes on her as she fell into step beside him. No one spoke to her, but their silence was its own language, judgment wrapped in observation. The walk to the river was long enough for the cold to creep into her bones. Tyan didn't slow his pace, and she refused to ask him to, matching his strides as best she could with her bare feet crunching over snow-crusted earth. When they reached the riverbank, a thin mist hung over the water, the edges of the current rimmed in ice. Without a word, Tyan set down his spear and began to strip branches from a fallen tree. "We'll need a rack for the fish," he said. "If you can build it, I'll bring the catch." Nahila set to work, her fingers stinging as she wrestled the green branches into shape. She remembered how her father had shown her similar work when she was a child, before sickness had taken him. The memory steadied her hands, and soon she had a rough but functional frame propped against the bank. Tyan returned with 3 river trout, their scales flashing silver in the dim light. He studied her work for a moment, then gave a short nod. Not praise, but not dismissal either. She cleaned the fish with a sharp stone, ignoring the bite of cold water on her skin, and laid them over the fire Tyan built from driftwood. The smell rose quickly, rich and savory, curling into the mist until even the wind seemed to pause. "They'll smell it back in camp," Tyan said, crouching beside her. "Let them. It will do them good to see you've earned your place." She met his gaze, surprised at the trace of warmth there. When the fish were done, they wrapped them in bark for the walk home. Back in the camp, the same eyes that had followed her departure now followed her return. Children paused in their play, and even the women by the fire glanced up, the sharpness in their looks dulled by the scent of food. Nahila handed the fish to Kiro and Mako, who carried them into the lodge without hesitation. As Tyan followed them in, he murmured just loud enough for her to hear, "You passed today." But the winter's long. His words were both a warning and a thread of hope, and as Nahila stepped inside after him, she knew this was only the first battle in a war she intended to win. That night, the wind came in from the north with a voice like tearing cloth, rattling the lodge walls and driving the cold through every seam. Nahila woke to the sound of Kiro coughing in the dark, the harsh, dry sound cutting through the steady crackle of the fire. She rose and went to him, laying a hand on his forehead. Warm. Too warm. Mako stirred beside him, blinking at her through the dim glow. "He was fine yesterday," Mako whispered, his voice edged with worry. Nahila glanced toward Tyan's sleeping form on the other side of the lodge. He didn't move, but she knew he was awake. His breathing had shifted. She didn't wait for his permission. She pulled her blanket around Cairo, tucked it under his chin, and went to fetch water from the barrel. The ice had formed thick across the surface, and she broke it with a sharp thrust of the ladle, the cold biting her fingers to the bone. When she returned, Tyan was sitting up, watching her. "It's only the start," he said quietly. "Winter sickness moves fast." His tone held no panic, only fact, but the weight of those words pressed against her chest. She brewed a tea from willow bark and dried mint, herbs she'd spotted among the lodge's stores, and coaxed Cairo to drink. The bitterness made him grimace, but he swallowed it all. Outside, the storm worsened, snow piling against the lodge until the walls shuddered under its weight. Nahila moved constantly, feeding the fire, drying Cairo's damp hair with the edge of her blanket, making sure Mako ate and stayed warm. Hours passed in that close circle of heat and shadows. The storm's roar beyond the walls like an animal trying to claw its way inside. At one point, Taiyan rose, tightened the lodge's outer bindings, and returned with snow clinging to his shoulders. He crouched beside Kiro, pressing his large hand gently to the boy's chest, as if measuring the strength still left there. "He'll mend if he stays warm," Taiyan said, his eyes meeting hers across the fire. There was no judgment in his gaze now, only shared vigilance. Through the long hours of darkness, they took turns watching the boys, Mako drifting to sleep beside his brother, Nahila and Taiyan trading quiet words about wood supplies, food stores, and the weather's turn. By morning, the wind had calmed, and Kiro's fever had broken, leaving him pale but breathing evenly. Nahila sat back, exhaustion flooding her, but beneath it was something else, a sense that she had crossed another unseen line. When Taiyan handed her a cup of tea without a word, she accepted it, feeling that in the language of this place, this was as close to respect as she had yet been given. The morning after Kiro's fever broke, the world outside lay buried in a silence so deep it almost hummed. Snowdrifts curved like white dunes around the lodge, and smoke from the camp's fires rose straight into the still air. Nahila stepped outside to fetch more water, her breath clouding before her, and paused when she saw Taiyan speaking with two elders near the main fire. Their voices carried in the cold, each word sharp and clear. "She can't just stay because you say so," one elder muttered. "She eats what the hunters bring. She has no blood tie here." Taiyan didn't raise his voice, but his reply cut through the stillness like the crack of an axe. "She's here because my sons would have been motherless without her." At that, both elders fell silent, glancing past him toward her. She turned away quickly, dipping her bucket into the snow to fill it with fresh powder, knowing it would melt for water soon enough. Back in the lodge, she found Kiro awake, his cheeks less pale. Mako crouched beside him with a small bone knife, carving something Nahila couldn't yet see. She knelt to warm her hands by the fire, but her thoughts were still tangled with what she'd overheard. When Taiyan returned, snow clinging to his braids, he set down a bundle of kindling and looked at her directly. "The river will freeze over in days," he said. "When it does, we'll be trapped until the thaw. If you mean to stay through that, you'll need to prove more than kindness." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Tell me what needs doing." His lips curved, not into a smile, but into something like acceptance. "Tomorrow we ride to the ridge. I'll show you the snares. If you can keep them tended and bring back what's caught, no one will question you again." That night, as the boys slept, Nahila sat on her bedroll, her fingers working the edges of a scrap of deerskin she had saved. Without thinking, she began to stitch a simple pattern. Two small figures beneath a larger one, all connected by a single thread of darker hide. She didn't know if she meant it as a gift, a token, or a silent promise. But when she set it aside and lay down, the weight of the lodge felt different, less like a place she was borrowing and more like one she might, with enough work, call her own. Outside, frost bloomed across the hide walls, and the night held its breath for whatever would come next. The next day broke brittle and bright, the sun a pale coin barely lifting above the horizon. Nahila wrapped herself in the heavy fur Taiyan handed her, its weight almost as much as his silence, and followed him to where two horses waited. The snow was deep enough to swallow her steps, but the horses broke a path, their breath steaming in the cold. Mako and Cairo stayed behind under the care of an older woman from the camp, though Mako had begged to come until Taiyan's quiet "no" ended the matter. The ride to the ridge took them past frozen streams and skeletal trees that clicked in the wind like old bones. Nahila kept her balance in the saddle, the muscles in her legs burning from the constant adjustment to the horse's stride. Tyon didn't look back often, but when he did, his eyes measured, not in doubt, but in assessment. At the ridge, they dismounted, the wind sharper here, cutting straight through her furs. Tyon led her to a line of snares hidden under drifted snow and low branches. "A hungry winter brings desperate animals," he said, crouching to clear the snow from the first trap. Inside was a rabbit, frozen stiff. He handed it to her without ceremony. "Skin it now?" Her fingers were clumsy with cold, but she worked steadily, the knife small but sharp in her grip. The fur came away unevenly, but she kept the meat clean, laying it on a strip of bark. Tyon gave a single nod before moving on. The second snare was empty, the third broken. The wire gnawed through. "A fox," he said, scanning the snow for tracks. "If it comes back, you'll need to reset it before it takes more." For hours they worked, resetting traps, collecting what the ridge offered. Nahila's back ached, and the cold had seeped into her boots, but she never asked to rest. Near midday, clouds gathered low and heavy, and the wind shifted. Tyon's voice was flat but urgent. "Storm coming. We go now." The ride back was harder. Snow stung her face, and the sky pressed closer, erasing the line between ground and air. By the time the lodge appeared through the white haze, her hands were numb, her thighs trembling from the ride. Inside, Mako ran to take the rabbits from her arms, his grin wide. "You brought more than Father sometimes does." Tyon's brow lifted slightly at that, and though he said nothing, he poured her a cup of hot broth before tending to the horses. The storm hit full before nightfall, wind howling against the lodge. As Nahila sat by the fire, the ache in her body was sharp but clean, earned. She thought of the snares still waiting on the ridge and knew she would tend them again, not because Tyon demanded it, but because with every step in the snow, she was carving her place deeper into the life she refused to be pushed from. The storm raged for 2 full days, a wall of white and wind that kept everyone close to the fires. Nahila spent the hours mending clothes with sinew thread, her fingers raw but steady, while Mako and Kiro carved small wooden animals by the hearth. Tyon came and went in brief bursts, bringing in snow to melt for water, tightening the bindings on the lodge walls, trading quiet words with passing hunters. On the second night, after the boys had curled together beneath their blankets, Tyon set a bowl of roasted rabbit beside her without being asked. "The snares you reset will hold," he said simply, lowering himself to sit across from her. The flicker of firelight traced the sharp planes of his face, and for the first time she noticed the thin scar running from his temple to the edge of his jaw. "You don't speak unless you need to," she murmured, unsure if it was a question or a statement. His dark eyes met hers. "Words can be spent like food. Better to save them for when they matter." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the cold kind. She broke it by reaching into the bundle at her side and drawing out the piece of deerskin she'd been stitching. She set it on the ground between them, the 2 small figures beneath the larger one, all bound by a single darker thread. "For the boys," she said, "and for you." His hand hovered over it for a moment before he picked it up, turning it slowly in the firelight. "You stitched truth into this," he said at last, echoing the words he'd once spoken about her tending to the boys. "It is not a small gift." The air in the lodge felt warmer then, though the storm still howled outside. They spoke little after that, but when Tyon banked the fire for the night, he left it burning higher than usual, and Nahila noticed his blanket was spread just a little closer to hers. In the dim hours before dawn, as the wind began to soften, she woke briefly to see him sitting upright, the stitched hide in his hands, studying it as if learning something new about her with each pass of his fingers. And though neither said it aloud, something between them had shifted, like the lodge walls after a heavy snow, settling deeper into the earth, stronger for the weight. When the storm finally loosened its grip, the camp emerged like seeds from snow, each figure wrapped in fur, faces turned toward the pale sun. Tyan told her they'd checked the snares that morning before other hunters reached them, and she was ready before he finished speaking. The world beyond the lodge looked remade. Drifts reshaped the land into strange hills, and the ridge loomed sharper against the sky. They rode in a silence that felt companionable, the snow beneath the horses' hooves creaking with each step. Nahila noticed the way Tyan kept a half-length closer to her than before, his watchfulness more present. At the first snare, she crouched without instruction, clearing the snow to find 2 fat hares caught cleanly. She handled them with quicker hands this time, skinning one while Tyan reset the trap. The second and third snares yielded more, another rabbit, and, unexpectedly, a grouse, its feathers bright against the white. Tyan's approval was unspoken but clear in the way he handed her the bird without taking it himself. At the farthest trap, they found tracks pressed deep into the snow. Fox again, clever enough to take bait without springing the wire. She followed the trail with her eyes until it vanished over a ridge. "I'll reset this one tomorrow," she said, already thinking ahead. On the ride back, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the camp. Tyan slowed his horse to match her pace and said, "The elders have been speaking again. They see you work. It is harder for them to call you outsider now." The words sank deep, not because they were praise, but because they were recognition. Back in the camp, Mako and Kiro ran to meet them, faces lit with excitement at the sight of the grouse. "We've never had one in winter," Kiro said, clutching it as though it were treasure. Inside the lodge, as she plucked the bird by the fire, Nahila thought of the ridge, the traps, the weight of the fur Tyan had given her, and the way the storm had closed them in together. She realized she was no longer counting the days she'd been here or thinking of when she might leave. Outside, the fox would return, the snow would deepen again, and she would still be here, working, proving, belonging in ways she hadn't imagined when she first arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back and a stubborn will not to be turned away. The following evening, after the boys had eaten and gone to play near the lodge entrance, Tyan told her they were to visit the council fire. The idea tightened something in Nahila's chest. She had avoided the center of camp since the day she'd arrived, knowing the stares that followed her. But she followed him into the cold, the light from the great fire painting the snow in gold and shadow. The elders sat in a semicircle, their lined faces reflecting both the flames and years of decisions. Tyan spoke first, his voice low but carrying. "She tends my sons as if they were her own. She works the ridge with her own hands. She has not asked for shelter without giving work in return." One of the elders, an older woman with eyes as sharp as ice, studied Nahila for a long moment. "And why have you stayed?" she asked. Nahila's throat felt dry, but she answered, "Because leaving would mean I never tried to be worthy of the place I was given." There was a murmur around the fire, some nodding, some remaining still. Another elder leaned forward. "A storm can bury a lodge. A stranger can bury a family. Can you promise not to bring harm here?" Nahila held his gaze. "Only the kind that clears away rot, like fire does." It was a risk, the edge in her words, but the elder's mouth twitched at one corner as if suppressing approval. The council did not declare anything final that night. Such matters were rarely settled in a single meeting. But as they rose to leave, the older woman placed a hand briefly on Nahila's arm. "We watch more than we speak," she said quietly. Back at the lodge, Mako and Cairo were waiting with questions, but Tyan only told them, "Your turn will come to be measured." Later, as the fire burned low, Nahila sat awake, the weight of the elder's eyes still on her. Yet beneath the nervousness was a steadier feeling, like the ridge under snow, silent, waiting, certain of spring. The thaw came slowly, a cautious drip from the eaves, a softening of snow beneath the boys' boots. Several days had passed since the council's first questions, days in which Nahila kept to her work in the lodge and on the ridge, always under watchful eyes. One morning Tyan called Mako and Kiro to him before the lodge, with Nahila standing uncertainly at the side. The council had sent word. They would decide that day whether she could remain. The three of them walked together to the council fire, and as they entered the ring of watching faces, the boys broke from their father's side. Mako took Nahila's hand without hesitation. Kiro wrapped both arms around her leg, looking up at the elders. "If she goes, we go," Mako said, his voice carrying farther than she thought possible. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. The elder woman with the ice-bright eyes raised her hand for silence. "It is rare for sons to speak so," she said. "Rarer still for them to mean it." She looked at Tyan. "Do you stand with them?" He stepped forward, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the firelight. "I do. She came with nothing, but she has given what matters most." For a long moment, the only sound was the pop of resin in the flames. Then the elder woman nodded once. "Then she stays, because she is already here." The words struck something deep in Nahila, a place she had kept braced for leaving. Mako grinned, and Kiro whooped, tugging her down so they could press their foreheads to hers. Even Tyan's mouth curved into the barest smile. The council dispersed, but the boys stayed close, holding her hands as though to anchor her. Later, back at the lodge, Tyan set the stitched hide she had made in the center of the hearthstones. "Now," he said, meeting her eyes, "this lodge has 4 threads." Outside, the snow still lay thick in the shadows, but in the clearing the ground was showing through, and the path between the ridge and the camp looked more worn, as if it had always been walked by the same 4 people. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had been at the council fire, would you have spoken for her too? Tell us in the comments.